The morning sun painted the palace walls golden as Thomas adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold London air, but from pure nervousness. Today marked his first day as a Queen's Guard at Buckingham Palace. At 22, he had dreamed of this moment since childhood, watching the stoic figures in their tall black hats, standing perfectly still for hours. Thomas came from a small town in Yorkshire where his father worked in a coal mine and his mother cleaned houses. When he told them he wanted to join the military and become a royal guard, they thought he was dreaming too big. His father laughed and said, "Lad, people like us don't guard queens. We work with our hands and keep our heads down." But Thomas was stubborn. He studied hard, trained his body, and saved every penny to move to London. The military training was brutal. Months of physical conditioning, weapons training, and ceremonial drill practice pushed him to his limits. Many quit, but Thomas held on. He remembered the moment he first put on the iconic red uniform and bearskin hat. It felt like wearing history itself. Now, standing outside the palace gates, Thomas watched the tourists gathering. They pointed cameras at him and his fellow guards, treating them like living statues. What they didn't know was that beneath the stoic expression, Thomas was fighting back tears of pride. His grandmother, who had raised him after his parents divorced, had passed away just weeks before. She never got to see him achieve his dream. The weight of the bearskin hat pressed down on his head, and the rifle felt heavy in his gloved hands. The uniform was scratchy against his skin, and his feet already ached in the polished boots. But none of that mattered. He was living his dream, protecting the monarch he had sworn to serve. As the morning progressed, Thomas learned the unwritten rules of guard duty: never smile, never acknowledge the tourists, and never break formation. But inside his mind, he was amazed by everything around him. The palace was enormous, with corridors that seemed to stretch forever. The other guards had warned him about the long hours, the physical strain, and the constant public attention. During his first break, Thomas met James, a veteran guard who had been serving for 8 years. James was tall and broad-shouldered, with kind eyes that seemed to see everything. He took Thomas under his wing, sharing wisdom that no training manual could teach. "The hardest part isn't standing still for hours," James explained while they sat in the guard room. "It's dealing with the loneliness. People see the uniform, not the person wearing it." James told Thomas about the tourists who tried everything to make them react. Children would make funny faces, adults would tell jokes, and teenagers would pose for selfies right next to them. Some visitors were respectful, but others treated the guards like decorations. "You'll see it all," James said with a knowing smile. "Just remember, we represent something bigger than ourselves." The afternoon brought new challenges. Thomas's legs began to cramp from standing motionless, and sweat dripped down his back despite the cool weather. A group of American tourists gathered around him, taking photos and making comments about his appearance. One woman even reached out to touch his uniform before her husband stopped her. Thomas wanted to step back, but he remained perfectly still, just as he had been trained. As evening approached, Thomas reflected on his first day. The job was harder than he had imagined, but also more meaningful. He wasn't just a tourist attraction or a symbol. He was part of a tradition that stretched back centuries. Every guard before him had stood in the same spot, worn the same uniform, and felt the same mix of pride and responsibility. Walking home through London's busy streets, Thomas still wore parts of his uniform. People stared at him with respect and curiosity. Some nodded politely, while others whispered to their companions about the real royal guard walking among them. For the first time in his life, Thomas felt like he truly belonged somewhere important. That night, he called his parents to tell them about his first day. His father's voice was different now, filled with pride instead of doubt. "Son, I saw you on the television news tonight. You looked proper official standing there. Your mum and I are proud of you." Thomas smiled, thinking about how much his life had changed. From a small-town boy with big dreams to a guardian of the crown, he had found his purpose. Before going to sleep, Thomas polished his boots and prepared his uniform for tomorrow. Each crease had to be perfect, every button shining. The ritual was meditative, helping him process the overwhelming emotions of the day. He thought about his grandmother, wishing she could see him now. Somehow he felt her presence, as if she was watching over him from wherever she was. The red uniform hanging in his closet represented more than just a job. It was proof that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things with determination and hard work. Thomas had become part of something ancient and honorable, a living link between the past and present. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, he was simply a young man who had made his dreams come true against all odds. 3 months into his service, Thomas had mastered the art of standing perfectly still, but nothing had prepared him for what happened on that rainy Tuesday morning. Sarah, a young woman with tears streaming down her face, approached his post, outside the palace. She stood directly in front of him, speaking in whispers that only he could hear. "My brother died in Afghanistan last week," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "He always wanted to be a royal guard like you. He said it was the most honorable job in the world." Thomas felt his heart clench, but his training kept his face expressionless. The woman continued talking, telling him about her brother's dreams, his service, and how much the royal family meant to their family. For 20 minutes, Sarah stood there sharing her grief with someone who couldn't respond. Thomas wanted desperately to comfort her, to tell her that her brother was a hero, that his sacrifice mattered. But the rules were clear. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't even show emotion. All he could do was listen and silently honor her brother's memory. When Sarah finally walked away, Thomas felt something inside him change. The job wasn't just about ceremony and tradition anymore. It was about being a silent guardian for people's hopes, dreams, and sorrows. He realized that many visitors came to the palace not just for photos, but for connection to something bigger than themselves. That evening, Thomas shared the experience with James, who nodded knowingly. "It happens more often than you'd think," James said. "People tell us things they can't tell anyone else because they know we can't judge or respond. We become like living confessionals." James went on to explain that over the years he had heard marriage proposals, last words from dying relatives, and countless personal struggles from strangers who found comfort in speaking to someone who had to listen without judgment. The revelation changed how Thomas viewed the tourists. Instead of seeing them as annoyances, he began to understand that many were seeking something deeper. The elderly man who stood silently beside him for an hour every Wednesday was mourning his late wife, who had loved the royal family. The little girl who waved enthusiastically every day was building courage to face her fear of starting school. The businessman who stopped by during lunch breaks was finding peace in the middle of a messy divorce. Thomas also learned about the darker side of their visibility. Social media had made their lives more complicated than ever before. Videos of guards fainting from heat, falling over, or having minor uniform malfunctions went viral instantly. Every mistake was captured and shared worldwide. The pressure to be perfect every moment was enormous because millions of people were watching, ready to turn any human moment into entertainment. One particularly difficult day, Thomas watched a fellow guard named Michael collapse during the changing of the guard ceremony. The heat, combined with standing motionless for hours, had caused him to faint. Instead of showing concern, many tourists laughed and took photos of Michael being helped away. Thomas felt anger rise in his chest, but he couldn't show it. That night, he visited Michael in the medical unit where his friend was recovering, with an IV drip. "The worst part," Michael said weakly, "is that people think we're not human. They see the uniform and forget there's a person inside. Thomas understood completely. They had become symbols rather than individuals, representations of tradition rather than real people with feelings, fears, and families. The job also meant missing important family events. Thomas's sister got married on a Saturday when he couldn't get leave. His nephew took his first steps while Thomas was standing guard. His parents' anniversary dinner happened without him. The royal family's schedule took priority over everything else in their lives. While other young men his age were building careers and relationships, Thomas was dedicated to something that demanded everything. But there were beautiful moments, too. Thomas witnessed proposals outside the palace where couples chose the romantic backdrop for their most important questions. He saw children's faces light up with wonder when they first saw the guards. He felt the genuine respect from military, families who understood the sacrifice and dedication required for the job. These moments reminded him why he had chosen this path. The physical challenges never got easier. Standing motionless for hours caused muscle cramps, back pain, and circulation problems. The heavy bearskin hat gave him headaches, and the wool uniform was unbearably hot in summer and provided little warmth in winter. His feet developed permanent calluses, and his shoulders ached from holding the rifle in the exact same position for hours. James taught Thomas mental techniques to cope with the physical discomfort. "Think of it as meditation," James advised. "Your body is still, but your mind can travel anywhere. I've written entire novels in my head during guard duty." Thomas learned to use the time for mental exercises, planning his future and processing his experiences. The forced stillness became a form of unwanted mindfulness practice. The relationship between guards was special. They shared experiences that no one else could understand. They looked out for each other, covering minor mistakes and providing silent support during difficult moments. When one guard struggled, others would subtly adjust positions to help. They developed their own sign language, communicating through tiny gestures invisible to the public. By the end of his first year, Thomas had grown both physically and emotionally stronger. He had learned to carry other people's emotions while maintaining his own composure. The young man who had arrived from Yorkshire full of dreams had become someone deeper, more empathetic, and more resilient. The silence that had once felt like a burden had become a source of strength, teaching him the power of simply being present for others without needing to fix or judge their problems. The morning everything changed began like any other. Thomas adjusted his red tunic, positioned his bearskin hat, and took his place at the palace gates. But as he stood at attention, he noticed a familiar face in the growing crowd of tourists. Emma, a local coffee shop owner from his neighborhood, was pointing him out to her elderly father who was visiting from Ireland. Thomas had been buying coffee from Emma's shop for over a year, always in civilian clothes after his shifts ended. They had developed a friendly relationship, chatting about everything from London weather to their shared love of old movies. Emma had no idea what Thomas did for work, and he had kept it that way deliberately. Dating was complicated enough without adding the pressure of his unusual job. Now, watching Emma's surprised expression as she recognized him in uniform, Thomas felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the thousands of tourists taking his photo daily. Emma's father, a proud Irishman with strong opinions about the British monarchy, began speaking loudly about the waste of money spent on royal ceremonies, while pointing directly at Thomas. "Dad, please," Emma whispered, clearly embarrassed. She kept looking at Thomas with a mixture of surprise, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Thomas wanted to disappear, but he had 3 more hours left in his shift. For the first time since joining the guards, he felt ashamed of his uniform rather than proud of it. That evening, Thomas waited nervously outside Emma's coffee shop until closing time. When she emerged, locking the door behind her, their eyes met across the street. The conversation that followed was awkward and painful. Emma felt deceived that Thomas had hidden such a fundamental part of his identity. Thomas tried to explain how difficult it was to separate his personal life from his public role. "I just wanted to be normal with you," Thomas explained as they walked through the quiet London streets. "When I'm with you, I'm not a tourist attraction or a symbol. I'm just Thomas." Emma listened, but he could see the hurt in her eyes. She had shared personal stories, dreams, and fears with someone who hadn't been completely honest about himself. The relationship that had been growing between them became strained. Emma struggled with the public nature of Thomas's job. Every time she saw him on duty, surrounded by cameras and tourists, she felt like he belonged to the world rather than having any connection to her. The man she had coffee with seemed like a different person from the stoic figure in the red uniform. Meanwhile, Thomas was dealing with new pressures at work. A documentary crew had been granted special access to film the guards, and Thomas found himself chosen as one of the featured subjects. The cameras followed him during training, ceremonies, and even some personal time. The attention was overwhelming, but refusing would have damaged his career prospects. The documentary brought unexpected consequences. Thomas's family back in Yorkshire suddenly found themselves local celebrities. His father was interviewed by the regional newspaper, and his childhood friends reached out after years of silence. Some of the attention was positive, but much of it felt invasive. People from his past came forward with stories and photos, trying to profit from their connection to the famous Royal Guard. James, now promoted to a senior position, became Thomas's mentor through this difficult period. The hardest lesson, James shared during one of their conversations, is learning that this job changes every relationship you have. Family members treat you differently. Friends either put you on a pedestal or resent your success. Dating becomes nearly impossible because people can't separate you from the uniform. The documentary also revealed the personal cost of their service. The cameras captured guards dealing with fainting spells, muscle cramps, and the mental exhaustion that came from constant public scrutiny. Viewers saw the grueling training, the strict discipline, and the sacrifice of normal social lives. For the first time, the public got a glimpse of the human beings inside the uniforms. Emma watched the documentary when it aired, seeing Thomas in a completely different light. She witnessed his dedication, professionalism, and the genuine pride he took in serving his country. But she also saw how isolated the guards were, how their commitment required them to give up typical relationships and experiences that most people took for granted. The filming process had been emotionally draining for Thomas. Having cameras document his most vulnerable moments felt like another layer of exposure on top of the constant public attention. He began to question whether the sacrifice was worth it. The job that had once fulfilled his childhood dreams now felt like a prison of expectations and obligations. His breaking point came during a particularly difficult ceremony when protesters gathered outside the palace. While most demonstrations were peaceful, this group was aggressive, shouting personal insults at the guards and trying to provoke reactions. Thomas stood motionless as someone called him a puppet of an outdated system and questioned his intelligence and character. That night, Thomas sat in his small apartment, still wearing parts of his uniform, and seriously considered quitting. The red tunic that had once made him feel proud now felt like a costume that prevented him from being himself. He missed having normal conversations, forming genuine relationships, and living without constant scrutiny. But then he remembered Sarah, the grieving sister who had found comfort in sharing her brother's story with him. He thought about the elderly man who visited weekly, finding peace in the presence of someone who had to listen. He recalled the children whose faces lit up with wonder when they saw the guards, and the military families who showed deep respect for their service. Thomas realized that his role went far beyond ceremony and tradition. He had become a keeper of other people's stories, a silent witness to human joy and suffering. The job required him to sacrifice normal relationships, but in return, he touched hundreds of lives in ways he was only beginning to understand. The question wasn't whether the sacrifice was fair, but whether it was meaningful. The documentary had one unexpected positive outcome. Emma reached out to him after it aired, suggesting they meet for coffee like old times. When they sat across from each other in her shop after closing hours, the conversation was different. Emma had gained understanding about the complexity of his role, while Thomas had learned the importance of honesty in relationships. They both realized that loving someone in uniform meant accepting both the person and their commitment to something larger than themselves. The morning of the state visit started with unusual tension in the air. Thomas could feel it the moment he arrived for duty at 5 in the morning. Extra security personnel filled the palace grounds, and the normal routines were disrupted by heightened protocols. The president of a major European country was visiting, bringing with him not only diplomatic importance, but also increased security risks. Thomas had been selected for the honor guard, which meant standing closer to the visiting dignitaries than usual. It was a mark of trust from his superiors, recognition of his 2 years of exemplary service. He felt proud as he polished his boots to an extra shine and made sure every detail of his uniform was perfect. The first sign of trouble came during the morning inspection. David, one of the younger guards, looked pale and unsteady. He had been fighting a stomach bug for days, but didn't want to miss such an important ceremony. James, now the sergeant in charge, noticed immediately, but David insisted he could manage. The pressure to perform during high-profile events often pushed guards to work through illness or injury. As the ceremony began, Thomas took his position along the red carpet where the president would walk. Hundreds of media personnel lined the route, their cameras focused on every detail. The world was watching, and any mistake would be broadcast globally within minutes. Thomas felt the familiar weight of expectation, but also something new, a sense that this day would be different. The president's motorcade arrived precisely on schedule. As the dignitaries stepped out, Thomas maintained his stoic expression while internally marveling at being so close to world leaders. The president was smaller than he appeared on television, and his wife seemed genuinely interested in the ceremony, smiling warmly at the guards as she passed. Then disaster struck in rapid succession. David, standing just 10 feet away from Thomas, began swaying visibly. Thomas could see sweat pouring down his fellow guard's face despite the cool morning air. In the military, they learned to support each other, but the strict protocols of a state visit made any intervention impossible. Thomas watched helplessly as David fought to stay conscious. The president was in the middle of his speech when David collapsed. The sound of his rifle hitting the pavement echoed through the courtyard, and his bearskin hat rolled several feet away. The media immediately swung their cameras toward the fallen guard, capturing every moment of his embarrassment and vulnerability. Thomas felt his heart racing, but forced himself to remain motionless. What happened next showed both the best and worst of human nature. Palace medical staff rushed to help David, while security personnel tried to shield him from the cameras. But the damage was done. Within minutes, footage of the guard collapsing was trending on social media with cruel comments and memes making fun of his human moment of weakness. The ceremony continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Thomas could feel the tension among his fellow guards, each one wondering if they might be next. Standing for hours in heavy uniforms under pressure and scrutiny took a physical toll that the public rarely understood. What looked like simple standing was actually an athletic endurance challenge performed in front of millions of critics. After the formal ceremony ended, Thomas was assigned to the afternoon reception duty. This meant standing guard while diplomats, politicians, and celebrities mingled in the palace's grand halls. It was usually a prestigious assignment, but Thomas couldn't stop thinking about David, who had been taken to the hospital for IV fluids and observation. During the reception, Thomas witnessed conversations between world leaders that would shape international relations. He heard discussions about trade deals, military cooperation, and diplomatic strategies. The irony wasn't lost on him that he, a working-class man from Yorkshire, was privy to information that could affect millions of lives, yet he was invisible to the powerful people discussing it. One conversation particularly struck him. The president's wife was talking to a British cabinet minister about the guards, commenting on their dedication and professionalism. "They're like living statues," she said with admiration. "I can't imagine the discipline it takes." The cabinet minister agreed, but added, "Though one did faint today. Rather embarrassing, really." Thomas felt anger flash through him, but his expression remained neutral. That evening brought more challenges. Social media was exploding with criticism and mockery of the guard who had collapsed. Cruel memes circulated showing David's face with captions about weakness and failure. Anonymous keyboard warriors who had never served their country or stood up for anything meaningful felt qualified to judge a man who had dedicated his life to service. The negative attention affected all the guards. Thomas received messages from friends and family asking if he was okay, having seen the footage and worried it might have been him. The incident reminded everyone how quickly their private moments of struggle could become public entertainment. The job required them to be perfect all the time, but they were still human beings with physical limitations. James called an emergency meeting with all the guards that evening. He looked tired, aged by years of managing the pressure and protecting his men from unfair criticism. "What happened today could happen to any of us," he said firmly. "David is a good soldier who pushed himself too hard out of dedication to duty. Anyone mocking him has never worn this uniform or understood what we sacrifice." The meeting revealed the emotional toll the job took on everyone. Guards shared stories of missed family events, health problems caused by the physical demands, and the difficulty of maintaining relationships when their lives were so public. Thomas realized he wasn't alone in questioning whether the sacrifices were worth it. But James also reminded them why they served. He read letters from military families who found comfort in their presence, from tourists who were inspired by their dedication, and from veterans who saw them as carrying on important traditions. "We don't do this for the critics or the cameras," James said. "We do it for the people who understand what service means." The next morning brought unexpected support. Letters and emails poured in from around the world, defending David and praising all the guards for their service. Veterans organizations issued statements condemning the online harassment. Even some celebrities used their platforms to educate people about the physical demands of the job. Thomas was moved by a letter from an elderly woman whose grandson served in Afghanistan. She wrote, "When I see you standing guard, I think of my grandson and all the young men and women who serve our country with honor. That brave young man who fainted yesterday showed more courage in one day than his critics will show in their entire lives." The incident changed something fundamental in Thomas's understanding of his role. He realized that their service would always be misunderstood by some people, but that didn't diminish its value. They weren't performing for social media or critics. They were upholding traditions and values that connected them to generations of service members who had stood guard before them. David returned to duty a week later, thinner but determined. He had received hundreds of supportive messages from people who recognized his dedication. The incident that could have ended his career instead became a testament to the resilience and brotherhood of the guards. Thomas felt proud to serve alongside someone who had faced public humiliation with such dignity and grace. 3 years into his service, Thomas thought he knew everything about being a royal guard. He was wrong. The promotion to senior guard opened doors to areas of the palace he had never seen and responsibilities he hadn't imagined. Along with the red uniform came access to secrets that would change his understanding of the monarchy forever. His new duties included night shifts inside the palace itself, guarding private family quarters while the royal family slept. These assignments were given only to guards with proven loyalty and discretion. Thomas felt honored, but also nervous about the increased responsibility and the sensitive information he would inevitably encounter. The first night patrol taught him that the palace after dark was a completely different world. The grand halls that bustled with activity during the day became quiet corridors filled with shadows and history. Thomas walked his assigned route, checking security points and maintaining radio contact with the central command. Every creak of Old wooden floors seemed amplified in the silence. It was during these night shifts that Thomas first witnessed the human side of the royal family. He saw them without the formal protocol, dealing with ordinary family problems that money and titles couldn't solve. The Queen Mother, now quite elderly, often couldn't sleep and would wander the halls in her dressing gown, looking lost and confused. Thomas would gently guide her back to her room, treating her with the dignity she deserved while protecting her from embarrassment. These encounters were never discussed or reported. The unwritten rule among senior guards was that what they saw, in private, stayed private. They were protectors not just of physical safety, but of family dignity and human vulnerability. Thomas understood that he was witnessing history's most famous family in their most ordinary moments. The most challenging aspect of the night duties was dealing with the younger royals, who sometimes tested boundaries like any other young people. Thomas had to balance respect for their positions with the need to ensure their safety and maintain security protocols. It required diplomatic skills they never taught in military training, finding ways to guide without commanding, protect without controlling. One particularly difficult situation arose when a young royal, feeling rebellious and frustrated with the constraints of palace life, attempted to sneak out for an unauthorized meeting with friends. Thomas discovered the plan during a routine security check and faced an impossible choice. Reporting it would create a family crisis, but allowing it could compromise security and his own career. The solution came through conversation rather than confrontation. Thomas spoke honestly with the young royal about the dangers and responsibilities that came with their position. He shared stories from his own youth about feeling trapped and wanting freedom, helping them understand that everyone struggles with limitations, even if the specifics are different. This incident led to Thomas being assigned as a personal security detail, a role that blurred the lines between guard and confidant. He found himself in situations that no amount of training had prepared him for, from family arguments to personal crises that could affect the entire nation if they became public. The emotional burden of keeping secrets was heavier than Thomas had expected. He watched family members struggle with depression, eating disorders, and relationship problems while maintaining perfect public facades. The contrast between public perception and private reality was stark and often heartbreaking. The people the nation looked up to were dealing with the same human problems as everyone else, but with the added pressure of constant scrutiny. James, now retired but still a mentor, warned Thomas about the isolation that came with these assignments. "The more you know, the lonelier you become," he explained during one of their monthly coffee meetings. "You can't share what you've seen with anyone, not even other guards. The secrets become part of you, and they change how you see everything." Thomas also learned about the extensive security measures that the public never saw. Hidden cameras, armed officers in civilian clothes, and sophisticated surveillance systems protected the royal family around the clock. The guards in red uniforms were just the visible part of a much larger security operation that included intelligence services, police units, and military personnel. The coordination required for even simple royal activities was staggering. A casual walk in the palace gardens involved dozens of personnel, security sweeps, and contingency plans for various scenarios. Thomas gained new respect for the complexity of protecting people whose every movement was monitored by both security services and hostile forces. During state visits and major ceremonies, Thomas witnessed international diplomacy up close. He watched world leaders interact privately, seeing the personal relationships and conflicts that shaped global politics. He overheard conversations about military strategies, economic policies, and international crises that wouldn't be reported in the news for weeks or months. The weight of this knowledge sometimes overwhelmed him. Thomas found himself carrying information about national security matters that could affect millions of lives. The responsibility was enormous, and the requirement for absolute discretion meant he couldn't share the burden with anyone, not even Emma, whose relationship with him had grown more serious over the past year. Emma noticed changes in Thomas that he couldn't explain. The cheerful young man she had first met seemed more serious, sometimes distant, as if he was thinking about things too heavy to discuss. She respected his need for privacy about work matters, but it created gaps in their relationship that were difficult to bridge. The most profound moment of Thomas's service came during a private family crisis that tested every aspect of his training and character. Without revealing details that would violate his oath of discretion, he found himself in a situation where lives hung in the balance, and his decisions could affect the future of the monarchy itself. The crisis lasted 3 days and required Thomas to work closely with senior palace officials, intelligence services, and medical professionals. He saw leadership under extreme pressure, watched family bonds strain and strengthen, and learned that duty sometimes meant making impossible choices with no clear right answers. When the crisis passed, Thomas realized he had become more than a guard. He was a keeper of family secrets, a witness to history, and a protector of not just physical safety, but institutional stability. The red uniform he wore carried the weight of centuries of service, and he was now fully part of that tradition. The experience changed his relationship with the job fundamentally. He no longer saw himself as just following orders or maintaining traditions. He understood that he was serving something larger than the monarchy, protecting the stability and continuity that allowed society to function. His role connected him to every guard who had served before and would serve after him. That night, after the crisis had ended and normal routines resumed, Thomas stood his regular post outside the palace gates. The tourists took their photos, the children waved, and the protesters made their speeches. But Thomas saw it all differently now. He wasn't just a symbol or a tourist attraction. He was a guardian of secrets, a protector of human dignity, and a servant of something ancient and enduring that transcended any individual or family. After 5 years of service, Thomas faced the most difficult decision of his adult life. Standing in the same spot where his journey had begun, wearing the red uniform that had defined him for so long, he knew his time as a royal guard was coming to an end. The reasons were complex, personal, and painful, but the choice had become inevitable. Emma was pregnant with their first child, a development that filled Thomas with joy and terror in equal measure. They had married quietly the previous year, with only close family present, keeping the ceremony private to avoid media attention. Now, facing fatherhood, Thomas realized he couldn't continue a job that required him to miss the most important moments of his family's life. The breaking point came during a routine ceremony when Thomas watched a fellow guard receive news that his daughter had been in a serious car accident. Protocol prevented the guard from leaving his post until the ceremony ended 2 hours later. By the time he reached the hospital, his daughter had undergone emergency surgery alone, asking for her father who couldn't be there because he was standing motionless in a uniform. That night, Thomas lay awake thinking about the sacrifices the big job demanded. He had already missed Emma's miscarriage the previous year because he was on duty during a state banquet. He had watched other guards struggle with failed marriages, estranged children, and the loneliness that came from being visible to millions but truly known by almost no one. The decision was made more difficult by his love for the service and the brotherhood he would be leaving behind. James, now retired but still a father figure, understood completely. "The uniform will always be part of you," he said during their final mentoring session. "But being a good father means knowing when it's time to hang it up and focus on what matters most." Thomas's final months of service were bittersweet. He trained his replacement, a young man from Scotland whose eyes held the same mixture of pride and nervousness that Thomas remembered from his own first day, passing on the traditions, the unwritten rules, and the emotional wisdom he had gained felt like completing a circle. The hardest part was saying goodbye to the people whose lives had touched his during those 5 years. The elderly man who visited. Weekly had passed away the previous winter, but his son continued the tradition, telling Thomas that standing with the guards had been his father's greatest comfort after losing his wife. The little girl who had waved every day was now a confident 8-year-old who still brightened when she saw him. Sarah, the woman whose brother had died in Afghanistan, had become a regular visitor, eventually starting a support group for military families. She always made a point to speak with Thomas when she brought new families to the palace, helping them understand that the guards were real people who honored their service and sacrifice. These connections had given meaning to all the hours of silent standing. Thomas's departure ceremony was simple and private, attended only by fellow guards and senior palace officials. He handed over his rifle, removed his bearskin hat for the final time, and folded his red uniform with the same care he had shown every day for 5 years. The weight of the history he was setting aside felt enormous, but so did the relief of finally being able to speak freely and live normally. The transition to civilian life was more challenging than Thomas had anticipated. After years of rigid schedule and clear purpose, the freedom to make ordinary choices felt overwhelming. He struggled with the loss of identity that came with removing the uniform. In public, he was just another face in the crowd, no longer drawing respectful nods or curious stares. Emma helped him through the adjustment period with patience and understanding. She had seen how the job had changed him, making him more thoughtful, but also more guarded. Now she watched him slowly rediscover parts of himself that had been suppressed by years of emotional control and public scrutiny. It was like meeting her husband all over again as his personality emerged from behind the disciplined facade. Thomas found work as a security consultant, using his experience to help businesses and organizations improve their protection protocols. The job paid well and allowed him normal hours, but it felt empty compared to the sense of purpose he had known as a guard. He missed the connection to history, the feeling of serving something greater than himself, and even the unique brotherhood that came from shared sacrifice. The birth of their son, William, changed everything. Holding his child for the first time, Thomas finally understood what James had meant about knowing when priorities needed to shift. The tiny boy in his arms needed a father who would be present for bedtime stories, school plays, and scraped knees. The uniform had given Thomas honor and purpose, but fatherhood gave him love and responsibility that no job could match. 6 months after leaving the guards, Thomas returned to Buckingham Palace as a visitor with Emma and baby William. Standing outside the gates he had once defended, watching new guards in their red uniforms, felt surreal. The young man at his old post looked impossibly young and serious, just as Thomas must have appeared to the veterans when he first started. Emma pointed out different guards to the baby, explaining how Daddy used to do the same job. William was too young to understand, but Thomas felt emotional seeing his son in the place that had shaped so much of his adult life. The connection between his past service and his new role as a father felt meaningful, as if one chapter had prepared him for the next. A few tourists recognized Thomas from the documentary that still occasionally aired on television. They asked for photos and wanted to hear stories about his service. Thomas was polite but brief, still protective of the privacy he had fought so hard to regain. He answered their questions about the basic facts of guard duty, but kept the deeper experiences to himself. That evening, Thomas wrote a letter to the young guard who had taken his position. It was a tradition James had started, passing wisdom from one generation to the next. Thomas wrote about the honor of the service, the importance of the brotherhood, and the strength that would be required for the challenges ahead. He also wrote about knowing when it was time to move forward and how the lessons learned in uniform would serve him for the rest of his life. The letter ended with advice Thomas wished someone had given him earlier. Remember that you are more than the uniform you wear. The discipline, loyalty, and dedication you develop will stay with you forever, but don't let the job become your entire identity. When the time comes to choose between duty and family, choose family. The uniform will find another worthy person to wear it, but your children will only have one father. As the years passed, Thomas built a successful security business and became active in veterans organizations. He spoke at military schools about service and sacrifice, helping young people understand the real meaning of duty beyond the glamour of ceremonies and uniforms. His experience as a Royal Guard gave him credibility and insight that benefited both the military community and his civilian career. William grew up hearing stories about his father's service, not with boasting, but with quiet pride about contributing to something important. Thomas taught his son about honor, duty, and the value of serving others, while also emphasizing the importance of balance and family. The lessons learned from years of rigid discipline helped him be a patient and consistent parent. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Thomas would take out his old uniform and share memories with Emma and William. The red fabric still held the smell of palace dust and London rain. The brass buttons still gleamed from years of careful polishing. But the uniform no longer defined who Thomas was. Instead, it represented a chapter in his life that had taught him valuable lessons about sacrifice, service, and the strength that comes from standing for something larger than oneself. On the 10th anniversary of leaving the Guards, Thomas received an invitation to a reunion of former Guards. Standing in the palace's great hall with men who had shared his experience, he felt the bond that would connect them forever. They had all moved on to different lives, but they carried the same dignity, the same understanding of what it meant to serve, and the same knowledge that they had been part of something truly special. Looking back, Thomas realized that his time as a Royal Guard had been the bridge between his humble beginnings and the man he had become. The boy from Yorkshire who had dreamed of wearing the red uniform had grown into a father, husband, and businessman who understood that true honor came not from public recognition, but from private choices to do right by the people who mattered most. The uniform was now a memory, carefully preserved but no longer worn. The man who had worn it, however, carried its lessons forward every day, standing guard over his family with the same dedication he had once shown to the crown. In the end, Thomas understood that the most important post he would ever guard was not at a palace gate, but at his own front door, protecting the people he loved most.